We're back, and we've been talking about the political situation in the United States as it evolved when the Federalist Party went away and the Republican Party became the only party. But as I've already indicated, that party split up, and the election of 1824 was very complex. There were several different factions within the Republican Party, but by 1828, the next election, it kind of stabilized into two political parties, both of which drew their origins from the Republican Party, both of which claimed Thomas Jefferson as their founding father, the great man who had started the Republican Party back in the 1790s. And both of the new parties claimed credit for that. Originally they were calling themselves, I think I've already indicated this, they were calling themselves either the National Republican Party, and that was headed by Henry Clay, or the Democratic Republican Party, headed by Andrew Jackson. Eventually those parties sort of adopted new names. The Democratic Republican Party just simply dropped the word Republican and just called themselves the Democrats, the Democratic Party, with Jackson as its head. The National Republicans, who were always a little bit smaller in numbers, basically Jackson was the dominant political force of the time. The Jackson's branch sort of outnumbered Clay's branch. And so in a lot of elections, Jackson and the Democrats are going to win. So Clay and his faction of the former Republicans kind of had to come up with gimmicks. They couldn't just win a straight election because they'd get outvoted. But they tried a number of gimmicks over the years. And sort of the first gimmick was the name that they adopted. They started calling themselves the Whigs. And that's an odd word to use for an American political party. It refers to English history, and it goes back to even the 17th century, when within England there were the two factions in Parliament were calling themselves, or the names got used, and somewhat ambiguously, but the names were used for the Tories, who supported the king. Remember, England had these big disputes between king and Parliament. The Tories were the members who generally tended to be supportive of the king, and the Whigs were those who opposed the kings. Well, that's 17th century England. What did that have to do with 19th century America? Well, what Clay and then his party called the Whigs were trying to convey was the idea that they were anti-monarchy, as the Whigs of 17th England had been, anti-monarchy. And their implication was that Andrew Jackson was trying to make himself king. And so they're anti-king, anti-Jackson, anti-monarchy, and they call themselves the Whigs. And in the 1832 election then, it was Jackson and the Democrats versus Clay and the Whigs. And Jackson won. And that was, as I say, sort of the mark of the general edge that Jackson and the Democrats held over Clay and the Whigs. So in 1832, they just lost when Clay was their candidate and against Jackson. So for 1836, they kind of came up with a gimmick. The Democrats are going to be led by Martin Van Buren, who had been Jackson's vice president in his second term. Remember, in his first term, the vice president was John C. Calhoun, but Jackson dumped him, and in his second term, selected Martin Van Buren. And I think I told you, sometimes historians disagree over whether Jackson or Van Buren was the real political genius of the Democratic Party. And my feeling on that is it doesn't matter. They were both, really astute politicians, and they made that Democratic Party into a real powerful, effective organization that won most elections at the national level and at state and local levels. So they were both very skilled politicians Martin Van Buren was the ideal follower of Henry Clay, and of Andrew Jackson, and so he was a candidate of the Democrats in 1836. To counter him, and Clay sort of knew he had to, as I said, he had to come up with a gimmick. So what he did was he ran 4 different Whig candidates in the 1836 election. He had 4 Whigs in each region of the country, one in the Northwest, one in the Southwest, one in the Northeast, one in the Southeast. And the theory was, the plan was, that in each of those regions, the Whig candidate would have a popularity as sort of the local guy, that he would be a local son, and that they would be able to carry enough of those states, and it's going to be 4 of them, but that between them they'll carry enough states so that Van Buren could not get an electoral majority. And then the theory was, the plan was, that when the election was over and now it's now going to be have to go to the House because nobody will have a majority in the Electoral College, and then they'll work it out. They'll figure out which of the 4 is going to be the one to be the chosen one for the presidency, and the only idea is just to deny Van Buren an electoral majority. Well, it didn't work. Even though these local candidates reached popular, they were all local guys that had popularity in their region, none of them were able to win enough votes to keep the majority away from Van Buren. So Van Buren won despite the gimmick. All right, so for 1840, Clay comes up with another gimmick. He figures that a lot of Jackson's popularity was based on his military record, that he was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans back in 1815. And even though it was many years ago, Jackson still, at his rallies and so forth, would remind everybody about the Battle of New Orleans. And even though it's long past, from a political standpoint, it was a very effective gimmick, if you will, for Jackson, and it worked, and now it's carried over to Van Buren, who was not at the Battle of New Orleans, but he could just sort of say he was Jackson's follower, he was sort of his adopted child, and still cash in on the great popularity of the Battle of New Orleans and its great political significance for the country. So Clay figured in 1840, well, Jackson and now Van Buren are winning because of a military victory. Let's find a Whig military hero. So they found William Henry Harrison, who had been the American commander at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. Now, that's not nearly as popular as the Battle of New Orleans, and Americans may not have looked closely at the Battle of Tippecanoe, but a close examination reveals that it's not anything you want to brag about. You wouldn't want to admit it because the Battle of Tippecanoe was really a very unpleasant event for the United States Army. The Army came into an Indian town. This, remember, is in 1811 when, if you remember, Tecumseh was organizing the Indians and posing this very serious threat to continued American expansion. But at the Battle of Tippecanoe, mostly what the U.S. Army did was kill a bunch of women and children. So it's not anything you really want to talk about. But you know, in this business of patriotic gore, Americans sometimes don't look closely at facts. Americans have a long history of making their political judgments without regard to facts, without regard to truth. That's happened often in our history. And so Clay and the Whigs figured, well, it'll work here in 1840, and William Henry Harrison will be able to win as the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, even though maybe a lot, if you were honest about it, you wouldn't want to put that on your resume, but a lot of times politicians are not honest. So, you know, they claim things that aren't necessarily very honorable, but that's another story. So they're going to have Harrison as the hero of Tippecanoe to try to offset Jackson as the hero of New Orleans. And so he's going to be their nominee for president, and he's from the Northwest. He's from Indiana. So that's the Northwest. So to balance the ticket, they wanted to get, as a vice presidential candidate, they wanted to get somebody from the Southeast who would be locally popular, would have carry over some of the local Sun political attachments that maybe people in the Southeast would vote for their vice president, vote for the ticket, because the vice president was a local guy. So they kind of looked around and they found, as a Southeastern, a Whig from the Southeast, they found John Tyler, who was from Virginia. So okay, so that's a balanced ticket. You've got the presidential candidate from the Northwest and the vice presidential candidate from the Southeast, and the idea is you're going to draw votes from all regions by with the local popularity. And so then they came up with the slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And I've always sort of joked and said that the reason they picked Tyler was because his name started with T and it kind of worked with Tippecanoe. And that was, and that's being silly, but it's actually not far from the truth, because they just kind of picked out somebody from the Southeast to balance the ticket and offset, or complement the Northwest tie of presidential candidate William Henry Harrison. And this time, this gimmick worked. The Whigs won the election of 1840, and William Henry Harrison became president. John Tyler became vice president. Well, it kind of turned out, yeah, they've got a Whig still as the president, but it kind of turned out that nobody had looked closely at Tyler. They hadn't really done a thorough job of examining his political orientation. Officially, he was a Whig, but the reality, and this is sort of an oversimplification here, but the reality was he really didn't agree with Henry Clay. He didn't support any of Henry Clay's initiatives. He didn't support the whole program of the American plan, which by 1840, because Jackson has destroyed the bank, and the tariff has been sort of compromised down by the compromise tariff of 1833. So a lot of Clay's programs for the American system are languishing. The bank is gone, and the high protective tariffs have been cut back. So for Clay and the Whigs, the key is to get things back, and specifically to get the Bank of the United States reestablished, to get a third Bank of the United States going, because Jackson had destroyed the second one. So that's what Clay and the Whigs wanted to do. That's what his leadership of the party wanted to do. And in fact, Tyler is sort of opposed to that. The Whigs in Congress, led by Clay, who's back in Congress, and he's been there for since 1810, except the term as Secretary of State for Adams. He's a longtime great leader, and in the House, Congress passed a bill to. It's a little bit complicated. I'm kind of simplifying here to get through this quickly. But it's essentially about a reestablishment of the Bank of the United States. And Tyler vetoed it. He's a Whig vetoing the plan of Henry Clay, the head of the Whig Party. I mean, it's absurd. And so Congress passed another bill. They kind of tried to rework it in order to get Tyler's support. And they passed another bill, and Tyler vetoed that. So basically, to make a long story short, and it's kind of a complicated story, basically, all the Whigs resigned from Tyler's cabinet in protest. He's accused of not being a real Whig. He's denounced. He's sort of, again, this is all a little bit of an oversimplification. If we could have more time just on this period of history, it'd be a little bit more complicated. But basically, the Whigs kicked Tyler out of the party, and they said, you're not acceptable. So, coming up to the election of 1844, Clay has decided no more gimmicks. It's not worked out. Yeah, he got a president elected, but it didn't help. So he's going to run again. Clay is going to be the candidate for the Whig Party. Common sense. He's the real leader. He's been the basic spirit behind the Whig Party since its beginnings as the National Republican Party in 1824. He's the logical person, so he's going to be the one. No gimmicks, just straightforward Henry Clay for the Whigs. And for the Democrats, it's going to be Martin Van Buren, who's the former president. He had lost in 1840. But he's the ex-president. He is the sort of the second coming of Andrew Jackson. He's the great leader who had been a close partner of Andrew Jackson, who was still alive, although quite elderly. And so he's the logical person for the Democrats. He's Mr. Democrat, just like Clay is Mr. Whig. So the election of 1844 has shaped up as a clash between two of the all-time master politicians of American history, between Clay, who was an astute political organizer, and Van Buren, who's an astute political organizer. We've got the two heavyweights of American history, and the election of 1844 is going to be a classic controversy between these two great political leaders. And that's not what happened. Turned out that 1844 was a time in American history when the standard political organizations just were not working. They botched it. Both Clay and Van Buren, who are very astute politicians, but in 1844 they screwed up. They failed to realize that 1844 is not a year for politics as usual. This is not a thing where you just get your organizations out there and you just bash each other and then whoever bashes the most wins. No, there's something going on in 1844 that neither of them took account of. Neither of them, despite, I think these are two great, very astute, very clever, very skillful, very intelligent politicians, great political leaders. But their political sensitivities just failed in 1844. They failed to take into account sort of an odd element, kind of a wild card in American politics. That wild card was called manifest destiny. Manifest destiny. And that's a term that refers to the American belief that the whole continent of North America was destined. Manifest means that it's obvious, destiny, that it's just naturally going to become the possession of white Anglo Protestants. And that's been true almost since the very beginning. I mean, that was what came to America in Jamestown and in Plymouth. That belief that somehow white people are going to take possession of the whole American continent, the whole, at least North American continent. And that's what's been motivating the United States, and we've talked about it a lot, and this feeling that somehow we're going to drive the Indians out, and we're going to take over, and it's going to be Protestants, it's going to be the Puritans or the Anglicans or their followers. It's not Catholics. The Catholics are the Spanish and the French, and it's going to be us instead of them, and it's going to be us instead of Indians. So, and then we're going to take along Africans, but they're going to be slaves. So, because it's white people who are going to be in charge and are going to run things, and that's what America is all about. It's about America taking all of that land, starting with the first people who arrived at Virginia and said, "Hey, okay, we're going to live here. Goodbye, Indians." So that idea has been around since the beginning. But the words manifest destiny had not been used to describe it until 1842, when a newspaper man in New York used the term to refer to American history and America's future, our destiny, our manifest destiny. And that's become a very popular term. The phrase first appeared in a New York newspaper, and over the next couple of years it's used by a lot of newspapers, it's used by congressmen, it's used in political rallies, it's used in popular discourse, it's used frequently, and everybody's talking about, hey, manifest destiny, we're going to take over the rest of this continent here. It's going to be for us because we're the white people, and it's sort of our political destiny, it's our religious destiny, it's our historical destiny to take this continent, our manifest destiny. And neither Clay nor Van Buren, who were, as I said, very, very sharp, competent politicians, neither of them kind of noticed that that was going on, and that was something that, in order to really get onto the bandwagon in 1844, you've got to kind of get on the manifest destiny bandwagon. And they both missed it. But a guy who picked it up was, in fact, a relative unknown in American history. Clay and Van Buren have been around forever. Van Buren's been president. Clay's run for president twice, lost twice, but he's been a leader of Congress, and Van Buren was vice president and then president. I mean, they're well-known figures, but all of a sudden, here's the governor of Tennessee named James K. Polk. A relative unknown, not well known outside of Tennessee. Everybody knows that Tennessee knows him, he's the governor. But outside of Tennessee, he's probably not very well known at all. Just like today, the governor of Tennessee. How many of you know who the governor of Tennessee is today? And Tennessee was also the home of Andrew Jackson, and Polk was kind of a protege of Jackson, which was a definite advantage, a definite plus, to have sort of be sort of one of the followers of the great man, of Jackson himself. That's a definite asset. But even so, even with that sort of endorsement, with the sort of recognition of Jackson as sort of that Polk is the sort of the up and coming leader of Polk's own state, Tennessee, Polk's still not known very well. But he adopted unconditionally the concept of manifest destiny. He said manifest destiny is America's future. And as the advocate of manifest destiny, at the Democratic Convention, he defeated Martin Van Buren. Even though Van Buren was the ex-president, the logical head of the party, but this sort of unknown came along, just out of the woodwork, out of nowhere, appeared, appealed to the delegates at the convention, and won the Democratic nomination. So he became the Democratic nominee to run against Clay. Clay was, obviously going to be selected by his political party as their candidate. But during the general campaign, Clay sort of didn't really endorse manifest destiny, but Polk made it the central theme of his campaign. His basic slogan was, this was the slogan in 1844 for James K. Polk: the reannexation of Texas, the reoccupation of Oregon. The reannexation of Texas, the reoccupation of Oregon. Now, these are issues that I haven't talked about in this class, but I need to now. I need to get caught up on what the story is about Texas and what he means, what Polk meant when he said that we're going to have that he's advocating the reannexation of Texas, and why that was very popular with the American people and enabled Polk to win the election of 1844. A little background here. Texas had been part of the Spanish Empire, going back to the earliest days of the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs and so forth. Texas had always been a part of the Spanish Empire, but it was in a really far distant location. It was the very northern end of the empire, relatively inaccessible, a long ways away from the center of the empire, which was, in modern day Mexico City and that whole central Mexico portion. Texas is kind of out of the range of easy communication and transportation. So it was sort of an isolated spot. And frankly, Spain had a lot of difficulty getting people to settle there. Nobody wanted to go up there because it's too far away from everything. It's really out of touch with the mainstream of Mexico. And to be quite honest, the Indians of that area, the Comanche, were just unbeatable. The Spanish army sent several troops up there on several occasions to defeat the Comanches, and they always lost. They lost badly. It was they simply could not handle it. So Mexico had a lot of trouble getting people to settle there. Now, back in the 1720s, some missionaries had established some missions in an area, and just to keep it simple, an area around the modern day city of San Antonio. And there were some missions there, and they had converted some of the local people into Christians, some of the local Indians, and there were some settlers there. There were some Spanish settlers in that general area of what is now San Antonio. And so there were some people there, and they're traditional, Mexicans, but Spanish-speaking Catholics and so forth. But there weren't very many of them, and they were kind of on the outlying edge of the empire. So to try to get some more settlement there, in 1820, Mexico offered a special deal, which they did not normally do. They adopted a policy called the impresario, where they would allow individuals, normally Mexico, or the Spanish in Mexico, the government controlled settlement, the government controlled expansion. The government would send missionaries and send armies, and it would be done by the government. But and the government had tried to do that in Texas and failed. So they decided, let's let some private individuals, empresarios, give them a block of land in Texas and let them settle it. Let them bring in the settlers under whatever plans they want. Each impresario will be able to do his own thing, and they'll be able to be successful in settling that way. And we'll go through impresarios instead of trying to control everything ourselves. And so they gave a number of those grants, those impresario grants, and but not much came of many of them. Most of them, people got the grant and then were not able to take advantage of it. They couldn't find settlers to actually do it. But one of the impresarios was a guy named Moses Austin, who was an American, but had a lot of familiarity with the Spanish Empire. He'd spent a lot of time I think in Cuba. I don't really know all the places where he'd been, but he'd been around the Spanish Empire a lot. He was fluent in Spanish. He was very familiar. He was sort of a known figure. And so he was kind of a logical one to get one of these impresario grants, because he had connections within the Spanish government, within the empire government. And so he was one of the people who got one of these grants of a block of land in Texas, and then having the opportunity to settle it with actual settlers. And that was in 1820. Well, in 1821, two things happened to kind of ruin that. One, Moses Austin died, so that sort of was a setback for that plan. And two, Mexico became an independent country. The long story there. Mexico had been fighting for its independence for many years, and they finally won, and they established, eventually, well, they didn't establish the Republic of Texas until 1824, but basically they ousted the Spanish Empire. So there's an agreement in 1820 between Moses Austin and the Spanish government, and by 1821 they're both gone. So that's that. But the son of Moses Austin, Stephen Austin, who was like his dad, fluent in Spanish and very familiar with the Spanish Empire, he took over the grant, and he said, "Well, look, it's in my inheritance. I'm the son of the guy who got it." And the new Mexican government decided to honor the impresarial grant that the Spanish had made the year before. So the grant is now passed on to different parties, the inheritors of the grant, but now it's in effect. And Stephen Austin began relocating people, began recruiting people in the United States to go to settle on his grant in Texas. There were a couple of other impresarios, from other countries. There was an Irish impresario in there, and he had some settlements. There was a German impresario, and he never quite got it to go, but he struggled with it. And then there were a couple of other Anglos, a couple of Americans. So there are several impresario grants operating in Texas. By far the biggest and most successful of them, the dominant one, was that of Stephen Austin. And Austin was a real honest guy. He was a really capable guy. People trusted him. And so he had a number of settlers, and he got along well with the established Mexican community that had been there for some time in the San Antonio area. Austin's grant was not far. It covered some of that nearby area. And he made a point of cooperating with and collaborating with the existing Mexican settlers. So he was, and Texas is a part of Mexico, but it worked, and with Austin's leadership, it's successful. By the 1830s, the early 1830s, Austin is sort of the recognized leader of Texas, and the number of Anglos in Texas, the people from Austin's impresario grant and the others, they actually outnumbered the Mexicans, some of whose families have been there for several generations. And they're part of the Republic of Mexico. It's complicated, but they're part of a state within Mexico. And they're not a single state, but it's complicated, and I don't want to get into it all because it takes me too much time to say the actual political arrangement, but they're like a territory of Mexico, not a state, but a territory. And that's not quite right, but I don't want to spend all the time to explain the whole structure of the Mexican government and the Mexican Constitution. It takes too long. But Texas is there, and they're recognized. Now, there are a few complications here, though, that I do have to talk about. Officially, Catholicism is the religion of Mexico. It's the established religion. And most of the Americans, those on Austin's land and those on the various other smaller lands of other impresarios, they're almost all Protestants. So technically, they're not in compliance with Mexican law. But it's not a big issue. They don't make a big issue of it. They don't denounce the extent of the religious Catholic. There's a Catholic church at the mission, and that would serve the Mexicans. It would provide them, with Sunday services with baptisms and marriages and so forth. There's a priest there. And the Americans they just kind of kept a low profile and didn't make a big deal about the fact that they don't accept Catholicism. So it's just sort of not an issue. And there's another thing that's not an issue, but it's very serious, very serious. What are these people doing? What are the Americans doing for a living? Well, they're farming, of course. That's what everybody does. They're there to farm. And what are they growing? Well, you might have not heard it because I mentioned it previously in another context. They're growing cotton. Texas, at least East Texas, is part of that broad band that I've talked about of cotton-producing areas in the deep South. And it covers from South Carolina through western Georgia into Alabama and Mississippi, Louisiana, and East Texas. So this is cotton country. And that means, I hope you're following this, I hope you can guess where I'm going, that you know the word. That means that slavery is a big part of the Anglo settlements within Texas. It also means that they are heavily involved in international trade. One of the main activities of growing cotton is to ship it out. And the port of what is now near Houston, that port, a natural port there, was a relatively major port, coming in and taking cotton from the Texas farmers and either hauling it to New England for the American textile mills or hauling it to England for the English textile mills. And so Texas is heavily involved in international trade, and the rest of Mexico is not. And especially the area just south of Texas, on the other side of the Rio Grande, which is politically the same part as Texas, the state of Coahuila. I'm trying to avoid all of that, but Texas is technically a part of the state of Coahuila, and most of Coahuila, south of the Rio Grande, is standard Mexican farmers. Farmers not engaged in commercial agriculture like Americans are, traditional Catholic, which we're not, and yet that's the state, that's the actual government for Texas. So none of this works. A big issue still for the American settlers was continued struggles with the Indians off to the northwest, the Comanches and the Apaches. They have continued struggles against them, and so for them, defense is a major issue, defense against the Indians. It's not an issue for the state government in Coahuila, on the other side of the Rio Grande. And so the people of Texas are conscious of the fact that, yeah, they're in Mexico, but they really don't quite belong there. They're not Catholic, and nobody bothers them about that. Nobody's coming out and trying to convert them or anything, but they're kind of sensitive to the fact that they don't quite fit into Mexico because they're not Catholic. Nobody from Mexico is trying to deal with the issue of slavery. In 1829, however, Mexico abolished slavery. And so slavery in Texas was a violation of Mexican law. starting in 1829. And nobody from Mexico is enforcing that law. Nobody is coming up to from the government and saying, hey, you guys are breaking the law, we're going to arrest you. Local law enforcement is sort of non-existent, so nobody's hassling these people about the fact that they're in violation of law, but they're very sensitive to the fact that they are in violation of law, and they're very sensitive to the fact that if anybody in Mexico ever decides to enforce the law is on that person's side. And these Americans, these Anglos with their slaves, are criminals. They're illegal aliens in Texas. They're breaking the law. They're not Mexican citizens. They're just living there. And so their legal status is very, very uncertain. That if anybody ever tries to make an issue of it, they're going to lose because they're breaking the law. And then a final issue for these people that's sort of related to this is that, frankly, sometimes Mexican land law can be extremely complicated. And at one time I almost understood Mexican land law, and then it just got too complicated and I just gave up trying to understand all of the technicalities. And the Americans theoretically have legal status there because of the Empresario grant. And that was issued first by the Spanish government, and then it was renewed by the Mexican government once Mexico became independent. So theoretically, they've got secure titles to their land. But the land law is so complex that there's a fear that somebody could come along and say, oh no, this law doesn't belong to these guys because they're not Mexican citizens. I am. It belongs to me. And that somebody could just come in, some Mexican could just come in from Mexico City or someplace and say, oh, this land is mine. And if there's a court there, then some judge will come in and say, yeah, it belongs to him under one of these complexities and the intricacies of Mexican land law. So there's a lot of insecurity, there's a lot of feeling among the Anglo community of Texas that their status is very fragile. It's very uncertain. It's not secure. They don't have, there's all kinds of things that they're aware of could blow up in their face, and they could lose their land and just be forced to go back to the States, and here they've got a successful cotton farm there, and they could lose it all. And they're making a lot of money because there's a good demand for cotton, and they're producing good quantities of cotton, and they're shipping it up to the textile mills in New England or shipping it off to England, they've got a lot going for them. But they don't have any security. They don't have a sense that this is really ours. This is my land, and the law is on my side. They know the law is not on their side. The law on slavery is not on their side, and they're afraid that even their title, which they hope is based on the Empresario grant, but there's all sorts of complexities. There's all sorts of gimmicks and loopholes and so forth where somebody could take advantage of it and take their land. So there's a lot of insecurity among these Anglos. In 1835, the great leader of the community, the highly respected Stephen Austin, went to Mexico City to plead the case of the people in Texas. And he's highly respected, and they just have a lot of hope for him. And he goes down to Mexico City to present his case to the Mexican government and see if he can get these things straightened out. He wants to say, he's got a list of things that he's going to raise, an agenda of issues that he's going to raise, and see if he can get some satisfaction, get some security, get some money to fight the Indians, to meet some of the needs of these people, these settlers there who have all of these problems. And I summarized them a minute ago, and I didn't mention one of the key ones is that that at any time if the Comanches decide to come back, man, they're gone. I mean, that's the end of the settlement. So there's a lot of insecurity there, and so Stephen F. Austin is going to try to straighten all of this stuff out with the central government of Mexico and forget about the state government of the state of Coahuila, of which Texas is officially legally a part. Well, at that time, the Mexican government is in turmoil, and it's been in turmoil a lot of the time since Mexico became independent in 1821, and I wish I could have more time to talk about the history of Mexico. I hope some of you will be interested in the history of Mexico. LA Harbor College does offer a class in the history of Mexico, and I would recommend that you take it. I think it's a very interesting class, and I'd love to spend more time on the history of Mexico, but I just don't have time. And just to say, things are in turmoil. And a key figure in that turmoil is a military officer and wannabe president named Antonio Santa Anna. That's a long story, and what's going on there is very complicated. But for our purposes, the only thing we need to know is that Stephen Austin went to Mexico City and went into a situation where there's all this political turmoil going on, and in the midst of that, he ended up in jail. Instead of being able to, come to the government and say, hey, look, here's what we need. These are some issues that we have. Is there something we can work out to deal with this? Get some clear titles in there. Get the courts to resolve that our titles to our land are set, and do something about the Indians. Improve our trade operations at the port there near modern day Houston. Just a lot of things, and then he's removed from the system. He's out of touch. He's gone, and he's in jail in Mexico City, of all things. Without him in Texas, new leadership is going to take over. And for reasons that I don't understand, I think maybe there are historians who do, and I just have never been quite able to figure it out. But there's a whole bunch of Anglos coming into Texas right now there in 1834, with 1835 when Austin is gone. There seems to have been a big influx of Anglos into Texas. And these are kind of different from the people who've been coming there up until this time. The people who've been coming there are farmers. They come there with the intention of farming. They bring their families with them. They make their homes there. They establish themselves in the community. And they even kind of work with the established people who are there, the Mexicans. And there's actually a certain amount of intermarriage among the Anglos and the Latinos in that area around San Antonio. The Anglos are over here and the Latinos are there, but people get together and boys and girls are doing then the same thing that they do today, and they end up getting married. So, although the Anglos are different, they're not legal, they're not citizens, they're not Catholics, but they kind of get along with the local people. They fit into the community, and they don't try to disrupt it. They don't try to make an issue of these things where they're out. They don't make a big issue of the fact that they're not Catholic. They just sort of, let the Catholics do their thing, and they just stay home on Sundays, watch TV, watch the NFL on TV, and they get along, and they've been getting along for a long time. And all they want is just to have things clear so that they can become clear residents, if not citizens, residents of Texas and part of Mexican Texas. That's what they want, and the reason they're upset is because they're afraid they're going to get kicked out because they don't have secure land, and they're breaking the law, and they're not Catholic, and they're doing all sorts of bad things. So they don't want to bother anybody. They just want to be accepted. But these new people come in. They're mostly single men. They're not families. The earlier generation, they're families. You know, they bring the whole family along to have a farm. And the new arrivals are just, nobody quite knows what they're going to do. They're just kind of loose cannons, and they don't seem to fit in, and they don't want to fit in, and what they want is not clear. And one of their leaders, one of the guys there is going to become the leader, is a guy named Sam Houston. And these people are then going to take a different approach, and they're going to try to say, we want to get out of Mexico. They're going to adopt some sort of resolutions based on the Declaration of Independence, and whoever wrote it was kind of illiterate and didn't really know much about the Declaration of Independence, but somebody wrote some documents, and eventually they're going to declare themselves an independent republic. And I sometimes speculate, well, what would have happened if Stephen Austin, who was bilingual and got along with the community. These guys are Anglos only, and they're some really wild and crazy guys, and they're seeking independence. A lot of them are, a good number of them are ex-soldiers of the United States Army, and so they have some military background and training, and they're really on a different side bent, and they're claiming themselves freedom. This is what they say: we need our freedom. We want our freedom, and that's why we're going to get out of Mexico. Well, what's the freedom they want? One of the main things they want is the freedom to own slaves, and because that's certainly one of the issues that's driving this, is this fear that slavery might be jeopardized because, after all, it is illegal in Mexico. So you get out of Mexico. Well, word of this rebellion reaches Mexico City, and it reaches Santa Anna, who was was claiming to be president, and was also had a military background. So Santa Anna led a large army into Mexico in 1836. He had quite a bit of trouble because a lot of his army were kind of unwilling soldiers, and he had a high desertion rate, and so his army kind of kept bleeding away as it marched up from wherever they started in Mexico and are headed towards the area around San Antonio, which is the center. I mean, that was sort of the main focus of both of the Latino and Anglo settlement. They came in, and the Americans, a group of them, decided to fortify themselves in an old mission. There was one of the missions that had been around there since the earliest days of the early settlements, over 50 years earlier, whenever it was. It was a mission that was known locally as the Alamo. It was abandoned as a mission, but it was a big old hunk of a building, a big stone building, very hard to attack or anything like that. It's almost impregnable. So there's a group of these Anglos who are these military people, hid out they took over the mission, the Alamo, as a very impregnable place to oppose the army of General Santa Anna. And Sam Houston told them not to go there because there was no access to water or food within the old mission, but they went anyway. They disregarded his recommendation, and they were surrounded by the army. And what took place then is this great battle. And after a couple of days of fighting, many Americans had been killed. So had many Mexicans, and the Mexican army is continuing to have a problem with desertions. But the Americans surrendered, and as far as we know, they were then all taken out and executed. So all of the Anglos there in the Alamo were killed. Santa Anna then marched on to continue his assault against the rebels, his plan to suppress this rebellion. And he went to an encampment along the San Jacinto, the river San Jacinto, and camped there one afternoon. And he and his army took a siesta, a nap, an afternoon nap. General Santa Anna did a poor job of providing lookouts as the troops were resting. And Sam Houston led another group of Americans and attacked General Santa Anna's army, decisively defeated the troops there who were not prepared. And as I say, Santa Anna had done a poor job of not providing enough sentries to alert the troops to the arrival of the Americans. And so the Mexican army surrendered, and General Santa Anna himself was taken prisoner by the United States. I mean, by the Mexicans. This is, I said, that's wrong. It was not the United States. These are Americans. Theoretically, at this time, the President of the United States is Andrew Jackson in Washington, and theoretically he doesn't have any knowledge of what's going on. This is all done by Americans who are American citizens, but they're living in Mexico, and they then defeated Santa Anna, and they proclaimed Texas as an independent republic, 1836, the Republic of Texas. Well, I think I'm close to the end of time, so I'm going to stop here, and we'll pick up, because the question in the United States is, what are we going to do about Texas? These are a bunch of Americans. And frankly, Sam Houston was a longtime personal friend of President Jackson. So there's a tie there, and there's a question about what are we going to do? And so that will be the starting point of my next lecture. For the quiz today, I'm going to just ask for a very, you can all give this very simple phrase, and every answer will be the same. There's no judgments on this. What was the campaign slogan of the Whig Party in 1840? What was their campaign slogan?